I hadn't realized I'd left it there. The journal, small and unassuming, sat in the middle of the coffee table, its soft leather cover slightly worn from years of use. I had meant to put it away, to keep it hidden like I always did, but the doorbell had rung, and in my rush to answer it, I'd forgotten. By the time I came back into the living room, Nathan was standing over the table, the journal open in his hands. "What's this?" he asked, his voice light but curious. My breath caught, panic flaring in my chest. "Nathan," I said quickly, crossing the room. "That's private." He looked up, startled by the sharpness in my tone. His eyes flicked to mine, and then back to the journal, his expression shifting to something softer. "Sorry," he said, closing it carefully. "I didn't mean to pry." I snatched it from his hands, clutching it to my chest as if it were something precious. My heart was racing, my cheeks hot with embarrassment. "It's nothing," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. "Just an old habit." Nathan studied me for a moment, his brow furrowing slightly. "I didn't read much," he said, his tone quieter now. "Just a few lines. But it didn't seem like nothing." I turned away, unable to meet his gaze. The journal felt heavy in my hands, the weight of it a stark reminder of the secrets it held, memories, confessions, pieces of myself I had never shared with anyone. "It's just something I do," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "To clear my head." "I get that," he said, his voice warm, understanding. I glanced at him, surprised by the softness in his expression. Nathan had always been thoughtful, more perceptive than most, but the way he was looking at me now, curious but not intrusive, made my chest tighten. "I shouldn't have left it out," I said, hugging the journal tighter. "It's okay," he said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "We all have things we don't want other people to see." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. For a moment, I wondered what he meant. What things he kept hidden, what secrets he carried. The moment passed, and Nathan moved toward the kitchen, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans. "Let me know if you need help with dinner," he said over his shoulder, his tone casual again. I watched him go, my heart still racing, the journal clutched tightly to my chest. It wasn't the first time Nathan had surprised me. He had always been good at that, ever since I first met him. This boy who had grown into a man so quickly, it felt like I'd blinked and missed it. When he moved back into the house a few months ago, I told myself it was temporary, that he'd be gone again soon, off to some exciting new chapter of his life. But in the months since, his presence had changed the house in ways I hadn't anticipated. For years it had been quiet here, the kind of silence that settled deep in your bones and made you feel older than you were. After my husband passed, I had grown used to that silence, to the echo of my footsteps in the hall, to the long, empty evenings spent with nothing but a book and a glass of wine. Nathan had brought life back into the house. It was in the small things, the sound of his music drifting from upstairs, the sight of his sneakers kicked off by the door, the way he'd pop into the kitchen to chat while I cooked dinner. He filled the spaces that had felt so hollow, so empty for so long. But he also made me aware of myself, of the way I looked when I caught my reflection in the mirror, of the way my heart beat a little faster when he smiled, when he laughed, when he leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching me with that quiet, thoughtful gaze of his. It wasn't right. I knew that. He was my stepson, for God's sake. But knowing it didn't make it any easier to ignore. Later that evening, as I sat on the edge of my bed, the journal resting on my lap, I found myself flipping through its pages. The handwriting was neat but unsteady in places, the words raw and unfiltered. I stopped on one page, my breath catching as I read the lines I'd written weeks ago. "I miss feeling alive. I miss being seen." The truth of it hit me like a punch to the chest. For years I had buried those feelings, telling myself that it was enough to simply exist, to get through each day without falling apart. But now, with Nathan here, with the way he looked at me, spoke to me, it was harder to keep those feelings at bay. I closed the journal and set it aside, my hands trembling slightly. This was dangerous, I knew that. But as I lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, I couldn't help but wonder what it would feel like to let myself be seen again. The next morning, I found Nathan in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a mug of coffee in hand. He was scrolling through something on his phone, the soft morning light catching in his hair and making him look younger, almost boyish. But when he looked up at me, his eyes were anything but boyish. "Morning," he said, his tone casual, though there was a faint edge to it. "Morning," I replied, avoiding his gaze as I moved to the coffee pot. My hands trembled slightly as I poured myself a cup, the events of the previous day still too fresh in my mind. I hoped he wouldn't bring it up, that we could just pretend it hadn't happened. But Nathan had never been one to let things slide. "So," he said, setting his mug down on the counter. "About yesterday." I froze, my fingers tightening around the handle of my mug. "What about it?" He shrugged, his tone light but probing. "That journal. You seemed pretty protective of it." "It's private," I said quickly, my voice sharper than I intended. "I get that," he said, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "I'm not trying to pry. I just—" He hesitated, his gaze softening. I couldn't help wondering what's in there that's so personal. I turned to face him, my chest tight. "Nathan, I told you, it's just something I use to clear my head. It's nothing important." His brow furrowed and he leaned forward slightly, his arms crossed over his chest. "It didn't seem like nothing," he said quietly. I opened my mouth to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped me. It wasn't judgmental or intrusive, it was curious, concerned. "Nathan," I said softly, setting my mug down on the counter, "it's not something I'm ready to talk about." "Okay," he said after a moment, his tone gentle. "But if you ever do want to talk, I'm here." The sincerity in his voice, the way he was looking at me, it made my chest ache. I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. For a moment, the silence between us stretched, heavy and charged. "I wasn't trying to make you uncomfortable," he said finally, his voice quieter now. I care about you, that's all." His words hung in the air, and I felt my breath catch. "I know you do," I said, my voice trembling slightly. Nathan hesitated, as if he wanted to say more, but then he nodded, picking up his mug again. "Okay," he said, his tone lighter. "I'll leave it alone." I nodded, grateful for the reprieve, but as he left the kitchen, I couldn't shake the feeling that the conversation wasn't over. Later that afternoon, I found myself in the living room, tidying up the scattered magazines and throw pillows that seemed to multiply when Nathan was home. The journal was safely tucked away in my bedroom, but the memory of his words lingered. "I care about you." It wasn't the first time he'd said it, but this time felt different. There was a weight to it, an unspoken depth that I didn't know how to handle. The sound of footsteps behind me made me turn, and I saw Nathan standing in the doorway, his hands shoved into his pockets. "You don't have to clean up after me, you know," he said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "It's not about you," I said, though my tone lacked conviction. He stepped into the room, his movements unhurried. "You do too much," he said quietly. I rolled my eyes, trying to brush off the comment. "I'm fine, Nathan." "You always say that," he said, his tone soft but insistent. "But are you?" I froze, the question catching me off guard. "What do you mean?" I see how hard you work to hold everything together," he said, his gaze steady. "But who's taking care of you?" The sincerity in his voice, the concern in his eyes, it was too much. I looked away, focusing on the magazine in my hands. "I don't need anyone to take care of me," I said quietly. "That's not true," he said, stepping closer. "Everyone needs someone." The weight of his words settled over me, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. I turned to face him, my hands trembling slightly. "Nathan, why are you saying this?" "Because I care about you," he said simply. The room felt impossibly still, the air between us charged with something I couldn't name. "You shouldn't," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Why not?" he asked, his tone gentle. "Because it's not right," I said, my chest tightening. "Because I'm your stepmother." Nathan shook his head, a faint, bittersweet smile tugging at his lips. "That doesn't change how I feel," he said softly. The honesty in his voice, the quiet conviction, it was overwhelming. I turned away, my hands gripping the back of the couch as I tried to steady myself. "Nathan, this can't happen," I said, my voice trembling. He didn't respond right away, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "I know it's complicated," he said. "But that doesn't mean it's not real." His words hung in the air, and I felt my resolve wavering. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, to put an end to this before it went any further. But the truth I couldn't admit, even to myself, was that he wasn't wrong. By the time evening rolled around, the tension that had been building all day felt almost unbearable. I tried to shake it off, busying myself in the kitchen with dinner. Cooking had always been my refuge. The rhythmic chopping of vegetables, the sizzle of oil in the pan, it gave me something to focus on, something tangible to control. But tonight, even that wasn't enough. Nathan appeared in the doorway just as I was setting the table. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed, his expression softer than it had been earlier. "Need any help?" he asked. I shook my head, keeping my eyes on the plates I was arranging. "No, it's all done." He stepped inside anyway, grabbing the silverware and placing it next to the plates. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, as though he was searching for an excuse to stay close. The silence between us stretched, heavy but not uncomfortable, and I found myself glancing at him as he worked. There was something about the way he moved, the quiet confidence in his posture, that made it hard to look away. "Thanks," I said softly, breaking the silence. Nathan looked up, his lips curving into a small smile. "For what?" "For helping," I said, though the words felt too simple for what I really meant. "Anytime," he said, his voice warm. We sat down to eat, and for a while the conversation was light. We talked about small things, his plans for the week, a show he'd started watching, the weather. But as the meal went on, the casual ease between us began to give way to something deeper. "You've been quiet today," he said, his tone gentle. I looked at him, startled by the sudden shift. "I guess I've had a lot on my mind," I admitted. "Care to share?" he asked, his gaze steady. I hesitated, my fingers tightening around my glass. "It's nothing important," I said, though we both knew it wasn't true. Nathan leaned back in his chair, studying me with an intensity that made my chest tighten. "You're allowed to have things on your mind. You know," he said softly, "you don't always have to carry everything by yourself." The sincerity in his voice, the way he looked at me as though he could see straight through me, it was disarming. "I'm used to it," I said, trying to sound casual. "That doesn't mean you should be," he said, his tone firm but kind. I looked down at my plate, unable to meet his gaze. "It's just hard to talk about some things," I said quietly. Nathan didn't respond right away, and when I finally glanced up, his expression was softer, his eyes full of understanding. "You don't have to tell me everything," he said. "But if you ever want to, I'm here." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning, and I felt my breath catch. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. After dinner, we moved to the living room. Nathan stretched out on the couch, his head resting against the arm, while I curled up in the armchair with a mug of tea. The soft glow of the lamp bathed the room in a warm light, and the distant hum of the cicadas outside added a soothing rhythm to the quiet. "I remember sitting here with Dad," Nathan said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. I looked up, startled by the mention of his father. "You do?" He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, he used to sit right there," he said, gesturing to the armchair where I was sitting, reading the newspaper or watching the game. A pang of bittersweet nostalgia settled in my chest. "He loved this room," I said softly. Nathan nodded, his expression turning wistful. "I miss him," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "Me too," I said, the words catching in my throat. For a while, we sat in silence, the weight of shared grief settling over us. It wasn't heavy or suffocating, but rather a quiet, mutual understanding that bound us together in a way nothing else could. "I don't know how you did it," Nathan said suddenly, his gaze fixed on me. "Did what?" I asked, confused. "Held everything together after he passed," he said, his voice tinged with awe. "I was barely keeping it together, and you were just there. For me, for everyone." The sincerity in his voice, the admiration in his eyes, it was overwhelming. "I didn't have a choice," I said softly. "Someone had to." "Yeah," he said, his tone gentle. "But that doesn't mean it was easy." I looked away, my chest tight. "It wasn't," I admitted. Nathan sat up then, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "You don't have to be strong all the time," he said quietly. The words hit me harder than I expected, and I felt my eyes sting with unshed tears. "Nathan, I hesitated, unsure of what to say. He reached out then, his hand brushing lightly against mine where it rested on the arm of the chair. The touch was brief but grounding, steadying me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. "I'm here," he said softly. The simplicity of his words, the quiet conviction in his tone, it was too much. I nodded, unable to speak, and let the silence settle around us once again. As the night deepened, the tension between us grew heavier, charged with something I couldn't name. And though we didn't speak of it, I knew we were both thinking the same thing. The house was silent when I woke later that night, the kind of stillness that presses against your skin and amplifies every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind outside. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying Nathan's words over and over in my head. I see you, and I care about you, more than you realize. My chest ached with the weight of it, a confusing mix of emotions I couldn't untangle. There was warmth in his words, yes, but also danger. A kind of unspoken invitation that I wasn't sure I was ready to accept. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my bare feet brushing against the cool floor. Sleep wasn't coming, not with my mind racing like this. I pulled on my robe and made my way downstairs, hoping that maybe a cup of tea would help quiet the storm inside me. The kitchen was dimly lit, the faint glow from the under-cabinet lights casting soft shadows across the counters. I moved quietly, not wanting to disturb the stillness. But as I reached for the kettle, I heard the soft shuffle of footsteps behind me. I turned, startled, to find Nathan standing in the doorway. Couldn't sleep? He asked, his voice low, careful. I shook my head, my hand still resting on the kettle. No? Same, he said, stepping into the room. He was wearing a plain t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair slightly tousled, his expression softer in the low light. We stood there for a moment, the silence between us heavy, but not uncomfortable. Want some tea? I offered, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, moving to lean against the counter as I filled the kettle and set it on the stove. The faint hum of the burner filled the space, a quiet background to the tension lingering between us. What's on your mind? Nathan asked after a moment, his tone gentle but probing. I glanced at him, startled by the question. What do you mean? You've been distant, he said, choosing his words carefully. Since dinner. Since earlier today, really. I turned away, focusing on the kettle as though it held all the answers. I've just had a lot to think about, I said softly. Like what? He pressed, his voice quiet but insistent. I hesitated, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. Like us, I admitted finally, the words trembling as they left my lips. Nathan didn't respond right away, and when I finally turned to look at him, his expression was unreadable. What about us? He asked, his tone steady. I let out a shaky breath, my chest tightening. Nathan, whatever this is, it's complicated, and I don't know how to handle it. He stepped closer, his movements slow, deliberate. It doesn't have to be, he said softly. Yes, it does, I said quickly, my voice breaking, because it's not just about what we feel, there are rules, boundaries. Boundaries that don't change the truth, he interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. I stared at him, my heart pounding. And what truth is that? That I care about you, he said, stepping even closer. That I see you, really see you, in a way I don't think anyone else has in a long time. His words hit me like a punch to the chest, and I felt tears sting at the corners of my eyes. You shouldn't say things like that, I whispered, my voice trembling. Why not? He asked gently. Because they're true? I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. The intensity in his eyes, the raw vulnerability in his voice. It was too much. Nathan, I began, my voice faltering. But before I could finish, he reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against my arm. The touch was warm, steady, grounding me even as I felt like I might fall apart. You don't have to say anything, he said softly. Just don't shut me out. The quiet plea in his voice, the sincerity in his eyes, it broke something in me. I felt the tears spill over, hot and unrelenting. And before I knew what I was doing, I stepped closer, my head bowing as I tried to catch my breath. Nathan didn't hesitate. He pulled me into his arms, his embrace warm and steady, and I clung to him like a lifeline. It's okay, he murmured, his voice a soothing whisper against my hair. You're not alone. The words broke me completely, and I sobbed against his chest, the weight of everything I'd been holding back finally spilling over. For the first time in years, I felt seen. I felt heard. And as Nathan held me, his hands gentle, his presence unwavering, I let myself believe, just for a moment, that maybe I didn't have to carry it all alone. The house was quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Nathan's arms were still wrapped around me, steady and warm, and I couldn't bring myself to move. His embrace felt too safe, too solid, as though letting go would mean unraveling completely. "You've been holding this in for a long time, haven't you?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded against his chest, the words too tangled in my throat to speak. "You don't have to carry everything on your own," he said, his hands gently rubbing small circles against my back. "You never did." The truth of his words settled over me, heavy and unrelenting. For so long, I'd convinced myself that being strong meant bearing everything in silence. But here, in Nathan's arms, I felt the weight begin to shift, the cracks in my armor widening. When I finally pulled back, his hands lingered on my arms, his touch grounding me. I looked up at him, my breath hitching at the intensity in his gaze. "Thank you," I said softly, my voice trembling. "You don't have to thank me," he replied, his tone firm but gentle. "I care about you. You don't have to do this alone." The way he looked at me, steady, unwavering, made my chest tighten. There was no judgment in his eyes, no hesitation, just quiet understanding. I took a shaky breath, stepping back to put some distance between us. "I should make that tea," I said, my voice unsteady. Nathan didn't stop me as I turned back to the counter, but I could feel his eyes on me, the tension between us palpable. I busied myself with the kettle, my hands trembling as I poured the hot water over the tea bags. "You don't have to talk about it," he said after a moment, his voice breaking the silence. "But I hope you know I'm here. Whenever you're ready." I swallowed hard, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill again. "I know," I said quietly, "and that means more than you realize." I handed him a mug, our fingers brushing briefly as he took it. The touch sent a shiver through me, and I pulled my hand back quickly, afraid of what he might see in my face. "Thanks," he said, his tone soft. We moved to the living room, settling into our usual spots, me on the couch, Nathan in the armchair. The warm glow of the lamp cast long shadows across the room, and the tea in my hands provided a welcome distraction from the weight of his presence. For a while we sat in silence, the quiet between us filled with something I couldn't quite name. I could feel his eyes on me, could sense the questions he wasn't asking, and it made my heart race in a way I wasn't prepared for. "You're different when you're with me," Nathan said suddenly, breaking the silence. I looked up, startled. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, his gaze steady. "You let your guard down. You're softer." The comment made my cheeks flush, and I looked away, focusing on the steam rising from my mug. "That's not true," I said quietly. "It is," he insisted, his tone gentle but firm. "You don't have to hide so much with me. You don't have to pretend." The sincerity in his voice, the quiet conviction, made something inside me ache. "I've been pretending for so long," I admitted, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Nathan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he studied me. "Why?" "Because it's easier," I said softly. "Because if I let myself feel everything, I don't know if I'll be able to keep going." "You don't have to hold it all in," he said, his voice steady. "Not with me." I looked at him then, my chest tightening at the intensity in his gaze. The space between us felt impossibly small, even though we weren't touching, and I could feel the weight of everything unspoken pressing down on me. "You make it sound so simple," I said, my voice trembling. "Maybe it is," he said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Or maybe you just make it harder than it needs to be." I let out a shaky laugh, the sound catching in my throat. "You don't know what you're asking of me." "I'm asking you to let yourself be happy," he said simply. The quiet honesty in his voice, the warmth in his expression, it was too much. I looked away, my hands tightening around the mug in my lap. "You deserve that," he continued, his tone softer now. "You deserve to feel alive again." His words hit me like a blow, and I felt the tears rising again. I blinked rapidly, trying to hold them back, but when I looked up at him, his expression softened even further. "It's okay," he said gently. "You don't have to decide anything right now. Just don't shut me out." The plea in his voice, the quiet vulnerability, made my heart ache. "I won't," I whispered, my voice breaking. Nathan leaned back, his gaze still on me, but he didn't press further. The tension between us had shifted, softening into something quieter, something fragile but unyielding. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. The storm rolled in that evening, the rain starting as a soft patter against the windows before building into a steady, insistent rhythm. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low, soothing sound that seemed to vibrate through the walls. I stood in the kitchen, staring out at the darkened sky as I absently dried the last of the dishes. The house felt warmer than usual, the lights casting a golden glow over the quiet rooms. But it did little to calm the storm brewing inside me. Nathan had been in the living room for most of the evening, the faint sound of the television filtering through the house. I had been avoiding him, not intentionally, I told myself, but because I needed space to think. But no matter how much distance I tried to put between us, I couldn't stop replaying his words from the night before. You deserve to feel alive again. The truth of it had settled deep in my chest, too heavy to ignore. I had spent so long trying to convince myself that what I felt didn't matter, that my needs were secondary, irrelevant. But Nathan had seen through that. And now, I couldn't unsee it myself. The sound of footsteps behind me made me turn, and I found Nathan standing in the doorway. His hair was slightly damp, as though he'd just showered, and he was dressed in a plain black t-shirt and sweatpants. He looked comfortable, relaxed, but there was a quiet intensity in his gaze that sent a shiver through me. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, craning back to the sink. "Yes. Just cleaning up." "You've been in here for a while," he said, stepping into the room. "I needed something to do," I admitted, my hands tightening on the dish towel. Nathan leaned against the counter, crossing his arms over his chest. "You've been avoiding me," he said softly, his tone gentle but direct. I froze, my breath catching. "I haven't." "You have?" he interrupted, though there was no accusation in his voice. "And I get it, I do, but I wish you wouldn't." I turned to look at him, my chest tight. "Nathan, this is complicated." "I know it is," he said, stepping closer, "but avoiding it isn't going to make it any less complicated." The honesty in his voice, the quiet conviction in his expression, it was overwhelming. "I don't know how to do this," I admitted, my voice trembling. "You don't have to know," he said, his tone steady. "Just let me in, that's all I'm asking." His words broke something in me, and before I could stop myself, I blurted, "I'm scared." Nathan's brow furrowed, and he took another step closer, his hand reaching out to gently touch my arm. "Of what?" "Of everything," I said, my voice cracking. "Of what this means, of what people would think, of what happens if I let myself feel this." Nathan's fingers tightened slightly on my arm, his touch grounding me. "Do you think I'm not scared too?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. I looked up at him, startled by the raw emotion in his eyes. "I've thought about this every day since I moved back here," he admitted. "About what it means, about what it says about me, about us. But the one thing I keep coming back to is that it's real. This, what I feel for you. It's real, and I think you feel it too." His words left me breathless, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely think. "Nathan, tell me I'm wrong," he said softly, his gaze searching mine. "And I'll stop. I'll walk away right now, and I won't bring it up again." I opened my mouth, the words caught in my throat. I wanted to say it, to deny everything, to put an end to this before it went any further. But I couldn't, because he wasn't wrong. Instead of speaking, I reached up, my fingers trembling as they brushed against his cheek. The warmth of his skin, the way he leaned into my touch, it was enough to unravel me completely. Nathan didn't wait. He closed the distance between us, his hands cupping my face as he kissed me. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as though he were giving me one last chance to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned into him, my hands clutching the fabric of his shirt as the kiss deepened. The world seemed to fall away, the storm outside nothing more than a distant hum. All that mattered was the feel of his lips on mine, the way his hands steadied me as though he knew I might collapse. When we finally pulled apart, our breaths were ragged, our foreheads resting together. "This is crazy," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Maybe," he said, his tone soft, "but it's ours." The weight of his words, the quiet certainty in his voice, it made my chest ache with something I couldn't name. For the first time in years, I felt alive. The morning came slowly, the pale light of dawn creeping into the room and painting everything in muted shades of gray and gold. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the events of the night before replaying in my mind with startling clarity. Nathan's touch, his voice, the way he'd looked at me as though I were the only thing in the world that mattered. It all lingered, filling the quiet with a weight I couldn't escape. I knew I should feel regret. Guilt. Something that told me what we'd done was wrong. But instead, all I felt was the steady thrum of my heart and the faint, fragile bloom of something I hadn't dared to feel in years: hope. I slipped out of bed, the cool floor beneath my feet grounding me as I made my way to the kitchen. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that comes only in the earliest hours of the day. I busied myself with making coffee, the familiar routine calming the storm inside me. As I poured the steaming liquid into a mug, I heard the soft shuffle of footsteps behind me. "Morning," Nathan said, his voice low and slightly husky from sleep. I turned to find him standing in the doorway, his hair tousled, his t-shirt slightly wrinkled. He looked at me with a softness that made my chest tighten, and I had to look away, focusing instead on stirring cream into my coffee. "Morning," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. Nathan stepped into the kitchen, leaning against the counter as he watched me. "Couldn't sleep?" I shook my head, taking a sip of coffee to steady myself. "No, you?" "Not much," he admitted, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Kept thinking about last night." His words sent a shiver through me, and I set the mug down on the counter, my hands trembling slightly. "Nathan, about last night?" "You don't have to say anything," he said quickly, his tone gentle but firm. "I know it's a lot to process. I need you to know that I don't regret it." The sincerity in his voice, the quiet conviction, it was almost too much. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice trembling. "You don't have to do anything right now," he said softly. "But I don't want you to think this was a mistake. It wasn't, not to me." I looked at him then, my chest tightening at the raw honesty in his expression. "It's not that simple," I said, my voice breaking. "I know," he said, stepping closer. "But we'll figure it out. Together." The words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting, and for a moment I felt like I couldn't breathe. "Nathan, this changes everything," I whispered. "Maybe it does," he said. "But maybe that's not a bad thing." The quiet confidence in his voice, the way he looked at me as though he believed every word, it was enough to make my resolve falter. I closed my eyes, letting out a shaky breath. "I don't want to hurt you," I said softly. "You're not," he said, his hand brushing against mine. "You couldn't." The warmth of his touch, the steadiness of his presence, it was overwhelming. I opened my eyes, meeting his gaze, and for a moment the rest of the world fell away. But then the weight of reality settled over me, and I pulled my hand back, the loss of his touch leaving a hollow ache in its wake. "I need time," I said quietly, my voice trembling. Nathan nodded, his expression softening. "Take all the time you need," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." His words settled over me like a promise, fragile but unyielding. I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. Later that morning, after Nathan had left for a walk, I sat by the window with my coffee, staring out at the garden. The storm from the night before had left everything damp and glistening, the sunlight breaking through the clouds in soft, golden rays. The house felt different now, quieter, heavier, as though it were holding its breath. I thought about everything that had led to this moment. The years of loneliness, the quiet ache of moving through life without someone to lean on. Nathan's presence had shaken something loose in me, something I'd buried so deeply, I hadn't even realized it was there. But what did it mean? What did it say about me, that I had let it happen, that I hadn't stopped it when I should have? I ran my fingers along the edge of the table, the same table where everything had changed. My chest ached with the weight of it all, guilt, fear, longing, and a strange, tentative hope that I didn't know how to hold. Maybe Nathan was right. Maybe I didn't have to have all the answers right now. Maybe it was enough to simply feel. When Nathan returned, the tension between us was quieter, softer, like the aftermath of a storm. He didn't press me, didn't ask for answers I wasn't ready to give. Instead, he simply sat with me, the unspoken understanding between us enough to fill the silence. As the day went on, I found myself thinking less about the risks and more about the possibilities, about what it might mean to let myself be happy again, even if it was complicated. The path ahead was uncertain, the future blurred and undefined. But as Nathan's hand brushed against mine, a faint smile tugging at his lips, I felt something shift. Hope.